One of the big things we talked about, especially being equity focused, is taking a hard look at what kind of barriers exist in all facets and operations of college. What I found a lot of times people will address those barriers, but then they don't do anything about it. People need to look at that. Right now, students are essentially treated as widgets, and that's where objectifying students. And yeah, administration drives. You could have a president come in, direct one thing, that person leaves, and then it's a whole nother thing. That instability can make things difficult. The last institution I worked at, I had 5 presidents in 6 years. You can imagine how that affected enrollment.
which mirrors CEOs and presidents in the private sector. SEM is industrial managing factories. It's an evolved version. Maybe we should think of these processes in the way that we did from an industrial standpoint and then put that overlay with students. It's an industrial kind of efficiency structure. You can't take a mechanical or industrial process and expect it to have humane outcomes.
Like taking that metaphor of industry, like here's the assembly line, and if at one point we're like, with this department, we're gonna interject a more humane or more student-centered, commendable things injected in there. That doesn't mean that as it goes down the whole line, it's completely transformed because it's tainted throughout.
An industrial model will produce industrial outcomes. What we're trying to do is intervene with different things on the conveyor belt, but it doesn't stop the fact that we're in a factory. But you have SEM executives, professionals, frontline folks are essentially line managers. And
Oh
so
yeah.
if you think of a line manager in a factory, they have a very exhaustive job. They're responsible for everything across conveyor belts, every injury is, which is why I go back to is what are those structural, those legitimate structural barriers that have been identified through every presidency? What are those things? How do you put a SEM professional in a position to be retained? It's by removing the crises or the structures that permit crises, inefficiency, like remove those things. Don't continue to throw SEM folks into the dissonance and this industrial factory and tell them they also have to humanize these folks while also continuing to produce industrial outcomes.
Meet these quotas.
I think more honesty in the equation doesn't fix everything, but I think it's a hell of a lot more of an improvement of what we're doing. And I think it helps focus on the actual issues. Financial aid for an entire field, and I'm not saying that there aren't groups and voices, but you would think there would be a lot more pressure and response from the federal government around issues with FAFSA and financial aid. Institutions, we can critique, there's lots of critique that goes to the local institution, but these institutions are children to larger systems that operate. And I think that the FAFSA and financial aid is a specific example of the, if you ignore the origin, you miss the forest for the trees.
It's
And there's only
funny,
so much you can do at the local level.
it's funny you bring up the FAFSA because just the disaster with FAFSA, especially this year with it was commendable FAFSA restructuring in phases. This year it's been publicized because it's so screwed up. And I feel sorry for people in financial aid. Justice involved can qualify for financial aid, but the rollout has been a disaster. Students have been delayed, whether at a national level or a microcosm of an institution. A lot of times we can put in place policies that are noble, but that we don't necessarily think of how it gets played out. And sometimes it creates more problems. Sometimes a noble policy can end up creating more barriers, even though it was designed to reduce them.
I understand what you mean. I don't project morality into policy. What you're describing is dissonance and the refusal to acknowledge root cause.
I think those kinds of things In smaller institutions, there is that, why don't you listen to us?
Yeah, I think there's different forms of dissonance, internal, external, and systemic. Part of burnout is what you're saying. To make that possible, it requires internal dissonance. It requires us to believe rhetoric that we know structurally or by pattern isn't possible. There wouldn't be an industry for fixing higher education if higher education was interested in fixing itself. The burnout comes from internal dissonance because the system is forcing folks to operate within the system. We want equity, we want to fix the problem, but then they don't listen. And so the person is, they get burnt out because they believe their values are aligned, as I put in my previous post, is to figure out whether we associate care, humanity, and morality with higher education. I don't think they are organic or indigenous to the structure of higher education. They're not. Even if they're not indigenous to higher education, they exist because the field appropriates care of the workers. Workers provide humanity within the structure. Burnout happens because administrators believe higher education's institutions are interested in fixing what they say they want to fix. They aren't. And
Well, what
that's what people are finding out and leaving jobs because they realize, and then we blame it on individual leadership. Yes, individual leadership is a part of it, but it's systemic. Blame it on one bad president when this is the case. Like,
yeah, relating that to our talking about how do we create enrollment management plans that are equity focused, mission focused. I think a lot of times within an institution, people are, we're going to branch off and do this, but we don't know if we'll get the return. Maybe it's targeting minority schools far
okay,
away. That's problematic. The people running the colleges, the presidents, the boards overseeing admissions and recruiting are looking at bottom line numbers. I think that's a shame because it's not focused on money. We're recruiting my more many one they talked about merit base and how that's become a joke. It's screwed up.
with little to no public responsibility. It's not a value judgment. The university or the field is slow because it moves when it wants to. It's not that it can't move, because when we say it takes so long, indoctrinates and it creates dissonance with people because they're like, oh, it is slow. And then they see examples where it isn't. They're like, hold on. You said it was slow, but the engineering school just got this. The why is the English department still using desktops? Got virtual. I get the process is slow because making the decision to move fast for what it wants to move fast for.
I totally agree. Leadership, driving and empowering people to make those changes because I've worked at colleges where the organizational culture is slow. Like the college I work at right now, you need people who push for change. Say it doesn't have to be like this. Policies like that, creating unnecessary barriers even within the institution of people working together to serve the students. And you
Yeah,
need that critical mindset, but in my experience, people aren't encouraged to do that.
I think we should stop here for the recording.